present in the room, please have a seat as we shall start in a few seconds. Okay, because today we have to be very, very punctual. So, we're waiting now for the connection. Okay, we have to wait for the lights and the cameras to be turned on. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Science Social Communication Congress. We start with a plenary session about an issue that is very important. It deserves a very important discussion: the climate emergency and communication. My name is Luisa Barbosa, and I work at the Society and Science Communication Center at the UPF, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Now, it's going to be a hybrid panel from many very different points of view, not only because of the fact that we have a virtual audience, virtual speakers, in-presence audience, an in-presence audience, and in-presence in-person speakers and many languages, etc. On my right-hand side, we have Olga Sarraz. She is our local expert. She's an expert in climate change, and she works at the Polytechnic University of Catalonia, and she's the director of the research group about the governance of climate change. On screen, we will have, with a very sustainable model in terms of CO2 emissions, some keynote speakers who are more than 1,000 kilometers away. James Kamkong, who is a senior professor at the University of Oxford and a associate researcher in the studies for journalism. And on the other hand, we have Hezeng Ling, who is actually president of the Intergovernmental Panel of Experts about Climate Change, IPCC. And we will also have James Hezeng Lee, Jonathan Lin, and James Painter. As part of the organization, we have collected a number of questions amongst the attendants, both in person and virtual, and they sent us these questions, and we sent them to Dr. Lee, who created a video to introduce this panel discussion and to approach some of the issues that will be discussed. So, before actually giving the floor to our guest speakers, let's start with this video made by Hezeng Lee, president of the IPCC.
Address your conference. The IPCC's new report last month had a huge impact. Despite all the challenges in communicating complex science, we now see unprecedented awareness of climate change. This shows that rigorous scientific reports and products prepared according to transparent, credible processes can get the message across to diverse audiences. We made big efforts to communicate the report effectively. You will hear more later from my colleagues. But a scientific report is in itself an important communications tool. You are meeting a few weeks before the start of the COP26 climate negotiations. you will not expect the chair of the IPCC to speculate on what those political negotiations will deliver. But I hope the negotiators will read the new IPCC report carefully. It provides a strong foundation and, dare I say, a wake-up call for their deliberations. IPCC scientists will be available to help them understand the detail. Thank you for the questions you sent me in advance. I will address some of them in my remarks today. Our report shows that there is no doubt that the climate is changing because of human activity. Indeed, the report includes a new focus on the attribution of climate change and extreme weather to human activities. Natural variability in the climate or other factors cannot explain the observed warming. We show that the only explanation for the warming we are now seeing is the emissions of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, agriculture, and land use practices, and other human activities. It follows that if climate change is caused by human activity, then changes in human activity can slow or stop it. Our reports have shown the impacts of different levels of warming, and governments therefore decided in 2015 to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels over this century. Our new report and the 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees show that pathways limiting warming to 1.5 degrees this century imply profound reductions and cessation in emissions. This involves unprecedented transformations in all areas of society and the economy. Governments have responded to our reports by pledging to cut emissions. We see that policymakers do pay attention to the science. However, our latest report shows that these pledges are not enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees decided by governments. We are not on track to meet that political target. But there's nothing in the laws of physics or biochemistry to prevent us from limiting warming to that level. It is a question of political will. Over the next decade, we will see whether we are on track or not, and whether more ambition is required, or whether politicians will pursue efforts to limit global warming with a different target. There's nothing alarmist about our reports setting out the likely impacts of continuing climate change. These are careful assessments of scientific research, making projections based on observations and other evidence. We can already all see the increases in extreme weather, including the wildfires in the Mediterranean, happening now as a result of the climate change that is already occurring. But communication science tells us that people need a perspective of hope in order to take action and not fall into despair. As you will see in the coming month, IPCC reports also examine possible solutions and look at the implications. All in all, we see that appreciation of climate change is at unprecedented levels among the public and governments. But there's much to do to ensure this awareness and understanding are solidly based on scientific evidence. Communication scientists can help us improve the way we inform policymakers, civil societies, and the public so that they have a good understanding of climate change, its impacts and possible risks, and options for addressing it. I hope your conference will contribute to this work. Thank you very much.
Estas son las palabras introductorias de Hwasung Lee,
So
el presidente
these
del
are the
IPCC.
introduction words of Hwasung Lee, the chairman of the IPCC, who has set up clearly two things. First of all, this event is occurring within a very interesting time context because we're in the middle between the publishing of this IPCC report at the beginning of August and COP26, which will be starting in Glasgow in November. And on the other hand, it mentions the three topics we will discuss through our guest speakers here today. On the one hand, the science of climate change. We know that exists with regards to the recently published report. On the other hand, the decision-making process and how this is based on scientific evidence. And thirdly, the role played by communication in all of these ecosystems. So to start, we will actually listen to a number of papers by our guest speakers who will actually start the topic to then have a general discussion. So we will start with Olga Alcaraz from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia, who will talk to us about the science of climate change. Go ahead, Olga. Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having invited me. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Well, I'm going to just share with you a few notes about some aspects related to science and also to the causes, the root causes of climate change. As mentioned by Professor Lin, nowadays it's absolutely certain. There is an absolute certainty that climate change is due to human activity. And it is a change. These are activities that are having an effect on the composition of the atmosphere globally. In the most recent IPCC report, there are some graphs that to me are crucial. The first one is the one I show on screen, where we see how the temperature has varied with regards to the average temperature in pre-industrial times since the beginning of our era and after the Industrial Revolution. Currently, the temperature increase has gone beyond 1 degree. Sometimes we think, well, that's not very important, it's trivial. Well, 1 degree centigrade is enormous in a temperature that's an average temperature. It is an average that comes out of making thousands of temperature measures in observatories that are present throughout the surface of planet Earth. I'm going to give you just one example. Imagine that I give you a thermometer to each one of you and that you measure your body temperature. There will be some people who are at 36.5, 36, 35.5, 37, 37.5. Maybe somebody who has the flu will be at 38. But when we have the average, probably the figure we will find is 36.5 degrees, which is the average temperature of human bodies. Now, when we think about what this additional degree, this additional increase of 1 degree with regards to the Earth's average temperature, which was 14 degrees, that's enormous. If we apply that to the average body temperature, it's as if we were doing this experiment I'm telling you about. And it's as if we found out that the average of our body temperatures, instead of being 36.5 degrees, was 39 degrees. In other words, this is an increase in one average variable, and it is occurring in a time lapse that's extremely short compared to the climate variability and the variations under these climate conditions throughout time. Now, this graph is also an important one because it reinforces what Professor Lee has just mentioned. how the simulations, which do not include the emissions due to human activity, they are not able to reproduce the observed temperature increase. And yet, when in climate simulations we include this variable, we realize how we reproduce through the simulations of the climate evolution the temperature increase we're observing. Therefore, nowadays, as I'm telling you, it is absolutely certain, with a very robust evidence, that climate change is caused by human activity. So we're talking about a global problem, and this global problem has very diverse impacts at a local level. Here, in the next slide, what we see is the temperature, or the increase in temperature in the planet observed in 2020 compared to the average temperature during the period 1951-1980. Now, if you look at, if we realize that this temperature increase is not at all distributed homogeneously throughout the planet, and we see that above all, in the highest latitudes, this temperature increase is already being very, very strong. And this implies the melting down of large ice caps in Greenland and heat waves in northern latitudes, in Siberia, enormous wildfires due to these large heat waves they have over there. So we have to bear in mind that what we are observing in our daily lives does not need to be equal to the average, throughout the Earth, throughout the Earth's surface area. The IPCC's latest report highlights that currently we can assign to climate change many extreme weather phenomena that we observe in our daily lives. For example, wildfires, large wildfires throughout the Mediterranean. For example, strong rainfall, storms in Germany, Belgium, China, large heat waves like the ones we have had in Canada and in the northwest of the USA. Increasingly, the certainty, the link between these extreme weather phenomena as one of the evidences of this climate change that we're already experiencing, the certainty is absolute. It is also important when we talk and when we communicate about climate change, we should not just stay with the most impacting headline, wildfires and floods. These are the consequences of the change, and therefore, if we want, with our science communication activity, if we want to try and bring forth elements to change that phenomenon, to turn off that change, we have to start talking about the reasons for climate change. The reasons are human activity and the emission of gases, greenhouse effect gases that you all know about, which basically is carbon dioxide, CO2, that comes from the burning of fossil fuels, methane that comes from the energy sector and partly from agriculture, N2O, CH4 for industrial gases, fluorinated gases, and finally, this is related to other gases that come from a land use change, CHA and N2O. So when we analyze the causes and when we analyze where these gases come from, we realize that within these causes we have the emissions that come from the energy industry and the emissions that come from the foodstuff production industry and the agricultural sector. And then we say, well, this is a systemic crisis because all of our human activity, all of it, is part of one of these industries when we do not consume energy, it's because, well, you know, it's because we're eating, but we also consume energy to produce food. So this is a systemic crisis that's closely related to a production model and to a consumption model. And this can also be seen clearly when we make an assessment of the emissions based on income levels. This is a graph that to me is quite revealing. Because here what they do is to classify the world population according to their income levels. And in this bar here, what we see in the middle bar is the share of cumulative emissions that we can assign to each one of these population segments. The headline would be 52% of the emissions come from a 10% from the richest 10% of the world's population. Whereas 50% of the poorest population is responsible for just 7% of the emissions. Now, these figures, what do they tell us? Well, what these figures tell us is that these emissions are associated to a production model and to an economic model and to a consumption model, and above all, we can associate them to the segment of the population with the highest income level. Oh God, I am voiceless. I think I've used my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. There are other aspects that will be cropping up during the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Your introduction has been very, very good to give us food for thought for the debate. Now I'd like to give the floor to James Painter. James will be on screen very soon. James will talk to us about the communication about climate change. What would be the context? How the context has changed, which is also very important to have good science communication. So James speaks Spanish very well, but he's going to speak to us in English. But welcome, James. James, you have the floor, sir. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to continue in Spanish. I apologize for that. My Spanish is a bit rusty.
I'm going to just spend 10 minutes, as you said, giving some of the context for climate communication. We'll go very quickly, but I'm very happy to share the presentation afterwards. This is a picture of Sir David Attenborough, who many of you, I hope, will know is a very famous TV nature documentalist. He's by repute the most trusted man on British television, so we have to listen carefully to what he says. And he said this just a couple of weeks ago to the G7 summit that was taking place in the UK. And as you can see, he said the fight against climate change is now just as much a political and communications challenge as a scientific one. So I want to develop that idea a little, the importance of really thinking hard about how to communicate effectively around climate change and the changing media, societal research and science context in which effective communication takes place. So I'm going to start with the media context. We know that for most people in most societies get most of their information about climate change from the media. And we know also what platforms are the most used source of climate change news. As you can see here, the most important by some margin is television. This is the results of a survey from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report of 2020 in 40 countries, including Spain. There are some variations, but particularly between generations, but this is the headline figures. So television, the most important, followed, as you could expect, by online news sites. And then in fourth place, alternative sources of social media, posts or blogs. As you can see, print newspapers are really very marginal now to people's receipt of climate change information. But what's really interesting, for example, is that specialized outlets covering climate issues like climate niche sites are increasingly important and much more important, for example, than print. So here is an example of some of them: Carbon Brief, GRIST, lots in English, lots in India, but also lots in other countries like China and India, but also in Spain as well. And these are really increasingly important at the intersection of science, media and policy. And we really need to think about them and how they are communicating climate change. So this is just one example of the general context in which climate communication is changing very rapidly. I apologize for being slightly self-promotional and showing this picture, which comes of a survey article we published with a colleague earlier this year about how is the media context changing in which climate communication takes place. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I would recommend that if you are interested in this, please go and read the article. For example, there are issues around, is it the case that there are fewer specialist reporters on climate change and more general reporters trying to cover a very complex issue? Is it the case that more and more journalists are becoming more advocates around climate change rather than retaining their professional objectivity? Really interesting series of questions, but the really key question is that there is a very dynamic media context in which climate communication is taking place. For example, in the last couple of years, there have been some major changes in many countries. So just to take my country, the UK, we've now got the first ever daily television show on climate. It goes out every day on Sky News. Last week, the BBC announced its first ever climate editor. Then we've got on the top right-hand side, you can see this big initiative called Covering Climate Now, which groups together more than 400 media organizations around the world, including El País and La Razón in Spain. And the thrust behind it is that they would argue that the climate emergency is here and the media needs to act like it. And then finally, I think what is really interesting in those countries like the US, UK, and Australia, and particularly the last two, where there's been a strong presence of climate denialism, some right-wing titles, which previously gave a lot of space to climate denialists of the science, are now moving more away from climate denialism towards more acceptance of the science. That's a really important development in those countries where climate denialism has been important. I won't go into it a lot, but visualization of climate communication is incredibly important. Many media outlets now using photo essays, infographics, videos, because they know that that's what gets shared a lot on social media. And they're putting huge amounts of effort into thinking through what type of visuals are effective. That was a very rapid look at how the media is changing, moving very rapidly onto society. And I think the key headline that everybody needs to be aware of is how much public opinion has changed in many countries over recent years, but particularly the last couple of years. You can measure a lot of things about climate change opinion. You can measure awareness, you can measure concern, you can measure desire to take action. What's really interesting is in the US, there's been a massive 10% increase just since March of this year in those people who are very worried or somewhat worried about climate change. In the UK, a survey that came out yesterday said that climate change was the most important concern over the next 5 to 10 years for people more than COVID or the economy. And this chart shows around the world from the Pew Center in the US, how the amount of concern about the personal effect of climate change has increased sharply since 2015. Just by illustration, in Spain, it's gone up 10 points from 2015 to 2021. Why is this important? Because when you're communicating about climate change now, the audience reception to it is very different, I think, than what it was, say, 5 to 10 years. There's much more awareness, much more concern. The science context, as we've just heard from Dr. Lee and Olga, the IPCC report that came out in August this year, we studied how the media reported that, and there are a number of really interesting aspects to it. One is the huge volume of coverage. I think the second one that we were particularly interested in was the level of what we call in English contestation, i.e. the level of commentaries or coverage that was criticizing the IPCC report was much reduced compared to previous years. If there was contestation, it was around the policy options and not the science. And perhaps we can talk more about that. In other words, that those people who are opposed to taking action, perhaps because it's too costly, or it's going to be too much of a personal sacrifice, or they prefer technological solutions, has become more apparent than those people who were denying the science. The next really important factor, as Olga mentioned, in the IPCC report, there was a lot about the link between extreme weather events and climate change, and the role that climate change has in making those events more intense or more frequent. I think this has really changed the conversation. It's made the link between experienced individual or community level weather events and global climate change. And I think that this is a really important area that we need to look at in terms of communicating climate change. One indication of just how much this aspect of event attribution science has changed, two of the leading scientists, Freddie Otto and Geert van Oldenburg, were actually named as two of the 100 most influential people of 2021 in Time magazine. And these are two of the leading scientists on event attribution. I think this is a real game changer. So the science context is changing a lot as well. Finally, the research context, I think, is important to think about, particularly as you're communication scholars and interested in communication. There are many new areas of climate communication research, including visuals and TikTok, Instagram, etc. I think what's really interesting, and one of the most important areas, is there's a huge body of social science research now on what is effective communication around climate change. And my main argument is that we have to look at what that research is telling us with the same attention that we pay to what scientists are telling us about the physical science of climate change. I think we are all guilty. Anyone who communicates about climate change, we do not spend enough time thinking about what does the research tell us. And one of the crucial aspects is when you're thinking about what is effective communication around climate, how are you going to segment your audience according to all their different values, their different attitudes towards the environment, because that will affect how effective your message is likely to be. So, for example, there's been lots of audience segmentation research now in the US, the UK, in Australia, and India, and Germany. And essentially what they're doing is classifying different audiences around their attitudes towards climate change or around their values. And that is what will really help you in deciding what is effective communication. Okay, so I've gone very quickly because I only had 10 minutes, but I hope I have given you the impression that the context in which climate change communication is taking place is a very dynamic area in all of these aspects. I haven't even talked about the politics, there isn't time. But communication is a crucial element now of the societal response. I think there's a general recognition that many of the things that we need to do are at the individual and society level, and you're not going to get change in behavior unless you think about how you are effectively communicating climate to different audience. And I repeat what I have just said, that I really do think we need to spend a lot of time thinking about and reading what the research out there already tells us about effective communication with different audiences. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much indeed, James. Brilliant. I believe that you have given us a very general overview about the ever-changing context of communication. And, well, you have given us food for thought about what is effective communication when we talk about climate change. We will go back to that during the general debate. And James' presentation is perfect for this panel discussion structure, because as I've said during the first, as he has said during the, when he mentioned David Attenborough's sentence, it's a policy and decision-making and scientific and communications problem. There is a third category in which we have structured this roundtable discussion, and we have the honor to have Jonathan Lin, the head of communications at the IPCC, who will talk to us a bit about the relationship, the link between scientific evidence, communication, and decision-making with a power to influence. Do we have Jonathan on screen? Yes, he is there. Hi, welcome, Jonathan. Over to you. Thank you for being here.
Very much, and hello, everybody. I just had a real scare because there was a power cut, which highlights the risks of these remote participations, but it's working again now, and at least we've...
Ya estaba diciendo que había problemas de conexión.
Right, so you are back,
Cut.
you know, you have a power cut again, right?
Sí, mientras recuperamos a Jonathan, yo creo que lo que podemos ir haciendo es abrir una pequeña...
So whilst Jonathan tries to connect back,
I think this the connection that I'm saying.
Okay.
Anyway, let me say a few words about the role of science communication in policy. And I should say, a lot of what I do in my job at the IPCC can't really be graced with the term science communication. I mean, really, we're just working very hard to ensure that we deliver the information in an efficient way to policymakers and the media and other stakeholders. And as far as communicating with policymakers, in particular, they are the core audience of the IPCC. I don't see a particular role for communication science theory, with a couple of exceptions, important exceptions, I'll come on to in a minute. Because I think, as Dr. Lee said in his introductory video, it's very clear that the governments are engaging with the scientific reports that the IPCC produces, and governments are setting policy on that basis. And indeed, the very important or very influential report on global warming of 1.5 degrees in 2018, that came out of the policy process that was requested by governments at the Paris COP. So the important thing is to ensure that we deliver information effectively to the people who influence policymakers. In other words, voters and taxpayers, and also business, so non-specialists. That's where it's important. That's the way that we contribute to the action of policymakers, by ensuring that the people that they listen to and are influenced by understand what's going on with climate change. Let me highlight two areas of that. Firstly, the need for clear language and clear graphics. Now, we all know that words are used differently in everyday usage and in science. And at least in English, an example that we're all familiar with now with COVID is the use of the word positive. If I go and have a test for COVID and it comes out positive, that means that I have the virus. But normally, in normal usage, positive is a good thing. If something is positive, we're normally happy or pleased about it. But here, it has the opposite use, the opposite impact on people. There are many, many examples of this, where language is different in the sciences and in everyday use. And it's important that we make sure that our scientists, when they're preparing reports, and the people, and especially when they're communicating them, understand. Now, this can benefit from a scientific approach. For instance, social science studies of the understanding of terminology through surveys and focus groups. Cognitive psychology can give us insights into how people read and understand graphics. Let me give you an example. We all know, and you keep telling our scientists, they shouldn't use the word mitigation because normal people don't understand what the word mitigation means. Now, mitigation is an important part of our work. One of our working groups in the IPCC deals with mitigation. So this already causes a problem. Another important working group is the one that deals with adaptation. And you might think that everyone would understand the word adaptation. We did a study on our behalf, the University of Southern California did a study on some key terminology. And they found that many people understand the word adaptation to mean turning a book into a movie. They didn't realize that there was a climate change concept there. Another example, a concept which is fundamental to our work, is sustainable development. Again, the study by the University of Southern California showed that many people, these people were surveyed in the United States, it wasn't a global survey, understood sustainable development to be something to do with real estate. The development is something to do with building apartments, maybe using environmentally friendly material. So the problem in terms of understanding of key concepts is much greater than we might think. In the same way, it's very important to ensure that the graphics we use actually facilitate communication and don't actually block to it. And again, we've been able to do user surveys of graphics, including with policymakers who are the end users of those graphics, to ensure that they come across effectively and efficiently. This too is based on the insights of social science and psychology. So we can work with our authors, not on what they say, that's for them to decide what goes into the reports, but their choice of language and expressing what they want. Secondly, we can draw on the social sciences and cognitive psychology for a more theoretical understanding of how communication works. And this came up as a question that we gathered in advance of this meeting. For instance, it's important that we show that we communicate the impact of climate change. It's important that we show the severity and the risks, and thus the need for urgent action. But we mustn't just fall into alarmism. We must show that there are response options too. Cognitive psychology, communication science, tells us that it's important that people have a sense of efficacy, that they can do something about the problem, they can take action. There are solutions, and we are empowered to take action. This is a very important part of communicating the problem. And this can, drawing on these insights, range from how the report is structured to the choice of images, and going to try to important the choice of images that we might include. We can also, in a similar way, look at an understanding of how storytelling works and the narrative arc that goes into something, that we structure our reports. Now I think I'm going to stop here because my time's coming to an end. But I just wanted to mention that many of these topics are going to be discussed in a special issue of the journal Climatic Change, which is coming out during the COP in November. I think although it's not open access, you will be able to find copies of those articles on our website of one of the editors, and I'll share that with the organizers of the meeting to get hold of. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias, Jonathan. Bueno, Jonathan,
Well,
ha hecho
Jonathan,
también
you have done such a
esta
good job
aproximación a la
about
comunicación
this
como
approach to communication
intermediaria
as an
entre la
intermediary
ciencia
between
y
science
la opinión pública,
and public
que al final
opinion,
influenciará.
which at the end of the day will also influence political decision making. And this is a very important message for the audience we have here in person. You have also talked about the use of language, the use of images. With Olga, we started watching certain images, which should also motivate our discussion. So now I'd like to open up the Q&A. We would like to open up this general discussion. If anybody amongst the in-person audience wants to ask a question, you may raise your hand. I could start with one ice-breaking question, which covers some of the topics that were sent to us before, the questions that they sent us before this session. And it also reflects a discussion, or a comment at least, that generated a lot of discussion in an event that was held a week ago or a couple of weeks ago by one of our sponsor associations. They organized a journal club recently for the first time. And in that journal club, the main topic was the use of images to communicate. And one of the topics that was mentioned, which is perfect for our panel discussion, is, well, they talked about the fact that in climate change communication in journalism, the main problem, the main hurdle is not to communicate the fact that climate change is happening, as shown by James Painter. There is a generalized acceptance of the fact that climate change is real, but the hurdle is how to face potential solutions or to make a call to action. So that's the first question I'd like to ask you. How can we strike the right balance between being catastrophic or alarm or calling people to being just alarmed? How can we, the catastrophic attitude involved in extreme weather phenomena, from a communication point of view, how can we turn that information or use that information in order to promote action, positive action, and a positive solution? So maybe we could start, well, let's get organized. Olga, maybe we can start with you because you're here in person. Okay, fine. Well, I believe that the point about how to communicate which course of action we should undertake in order to face the climate change problem is closely intertwined with the root causes of climate change. As I've said at the beginning, we always highlight the disasters and the catastrophes and the natural disasters because that's what really makes people react. But then sometimes we need to reflect a bit more in depth how this can be reconducted. The latest IPCC report and the report published back in 2018 about the 1.5 degrees, in those reports, they tell us what is the course of action that we should follow worldwide in order to stabilize the temperature. And the scientific community tells us that these are reductions that should be undertaken now, here and now. They have to be very ambitious and they have to be undertaken urgently. How do we communicate that? What does that mean? Well, when we communicate, we always highlight or we always put the citizen at the center. The message is, well, you should use more public transport, you should save more energy, You should have solar photovoltaic plates. You should. This is important. But there is another aspect that's also very important, which is that in order to favor a change of habits, to favor and promote the change of things, and the change should be fast, we need policies. Policies that make that possible, that ease that. Because we can't leave in the hands of goodwill the solution of the problem, because the problem cannot be solved based on goodwill alone and good faith alone. So we have to give some signals of hope. We have to say we can still change it, but we have to take quick and urgent action. And this quick and urgent action, it is not fair to just put the weight of that quick and fast, that the quick and urgent action on the shoulders of citizens. We need policies that promote that change. And to me, this is something that tends to be forgotten. We immediately give the hot potato to the citizen, to our daily lives. Talking about the audience segmentation, as James Painter said, well, we should communicate to different audience segments about this topic. Jonathan, would you like to react to my question, please?
Tell me what the question was in English, because I didn't quite catch that.
Should I say it in English? Or?
Please, yes.
Okay, yes. No, the question was how to balance the alarmism, the urgency of climate change, and a call to action when communicating.
Yeah, well, I touched on this in my remarks before, and it's essential that we avoid alarmism as such, because that can undermine the credibility of the scientific findings. But that doesn't mean that we should underplay the severity of what we're describing. We need to give people the facts and the information. But it's also important that you don't just give people a message of doom and despair. You have to give people a perspective of hope as well. And the hope comes from the options for taking action to address the problem that's being described. And indeed, the IPCC report set out the problem, they set out the risks, and then they lay out the options for tackling climate change.
Muchas gracias, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
No sé,
James.
Jonathan de nuevo
Well, Jonathan
a la esperanza.
talks about hope. Maybe we could also, James, maybe we could talk about how can we convey hope.
Answer, because again, there's a huge amount of research in this space, as you know. I think the question that Olga just posed is really important. What's the evidence for what type of information or visual information will inspire you to take action? I mean, I think Jonathan and everybody is right that you need a mixture of hope and fear, or sort of at least not alarmism, but alarming news. You need to tell people that these are really difficult things that are happening and are going to happen, but you need to also show what is the solution to get out of it. And I think there's quite a lot of convincing evidence that what inspires a general audience, I'm not talking about policymakers or business sectors, but if you're just talking about normal average people, despite all their differences and their different values and their different levels of knowledge, if you show pictures, images, videos of people like them, like you, taking action to do something about climate change, whether it's, I don't know, putting extra layers of lagging in your home, or having an electric car, or doing some sort of action that you think people like you, your neighbors, or people with the same sort of profile as you are doing, then there's quite a lot of evidence that that is a very effective way of encouraging people to take action. I think the problem for visualization, as you introduced your question, is more difficult, because it's much easier for the media and for scientists to show pictures of extreme weather events and very alarming negative impacts. It's much more difficult to show pictures, interesting, engaging pictures of people actually taking action and doing things. And a final point is, I think the media have been criticized in many countries for concentrating far too much on what we call in English the doom and gloom aspects, the negative impacts, and not enough on solutions. But I would say that in the last 2 or 3 years, there is evidence from scholars who've studied this that there has been quite an important shift away from just talking about these impacts and also talking about solutions. So just a little anecdote. In the report that we've all been talking about, the IPCC report that came out in August, it's quite interesting that even though in that report there's not enough about solutions because the solutions are coming in a later report, the media actually chose to, in many cases, do case studies of what people or societies or communities or cities were doing to reduce carbon emissions. And I think that's a really positive way forward.
Gracias, James. Yo creo que es muy interesante esto
Oh,
que
thank you,
mencionaba
James.
sobre
What
la
you just
distancia
mentioned
psicológica
about the
justamente,
psychological
¿no? Tan
distancing
próximos
is very
sentidos de la
important.
comunicación,
The closer we feel to the
a las personas
people
que aparecen en las
who
comunicaciones, en
appear
las
in our
imágenes.
communications, the images and descriptions, the more we are encouraged to take action because we identify with them. So the step forward should be to talk about the solutions and not only about the negative effect. There are 2 questions here from the audience. Go ahead, please. Can you hear me? Well, I wanted to thank James and Jonathan and Olga for the last part of the presentation. It's very unfair to put all of the weight on the citizens, the common citizen's shoulder, when there are no policies that could actually help us improve the situation. Especially there are no policies due to the vested interests of the business sector and their priorities. I wanted to ask Olga one question about the last part of her presentation. Just like in other areas, there is a denialist current about the anthropogenic or the fact that human action affects climate change. These people who deny actually, these denialists, are not as aggressive as others. And a lot of them have scientific training. So we can't say that they have no scientific knowledge. And these people who deny the effect of human action on climate change, they argue that in the past there have also been climate changes. And the human beings had nothing to do with it. So, Olga, as somebody who communicates, I mean, I am a communicator. I'm a scientific communicator, and I'm a climate change communicator. But I believe that we have a very, very serious responsibility as communicators, as climate communicators. And could you give me some basic arguments to combat, to struggle against this denial with a non-scientific audience, to actually make them understand that these people denying make no sense? Please, could you identify yourself? My name is Guillermo Pérez, and I come on behalf of the Scientific Committee of the Spanish Foundation Against Cancer. Fine. Well, I believe one image, the first slide I showed, and I spoke very fast, and maybe you didn't realize that I showed it, but there are climate models that allow us to make simulations about which would have been the climate evolution so far without the contribution of the emissions made by mankind since the Industrial Revolution. In other words, just bearing in mind or taking into account natural factors like volcano activity or small changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun. You do not reproduce the temperature changes that are being recorded. Now, when in these simulations we include the man-made influence, we see this temperature increase clearly. Simulations are made, and one way to validate them is to have the simulations of the present, simulations about the present based on past data. In that way, you can verify if the model works or not. When we include the anthropogenic component, we see clearly the evolution of this average temperature. And it is true. I have been following up the climate change issues since the beginning of the 90s. And people who deny it have always been present, but they've been reduced increasingly because the scientific evidence is so overwhelming that anybody with a minimum scientific training or anybody who takes the topic seriously cannot contradict it. These are anthropogenic causes. The attitude related to this denial is related to, oh, we can't do anything about it, nobody will stop this. This is worrisome, but it's another type of denial. You do not deny the causes, you deny the action. I've seen another hand raised, but I can't see it anymore. My name is Emma Garcia, and I work in the FECYT, the scientific area of FECYT. This is such a very interesting discussion, how to be an effective communicator without being pessimistic. And here, the role played by public policies is crucial. If we place all of the weight on citizens, we create hopelessness and climate anxiety. People are unable to manage emotionally this, especially young people. There is a growing psychological uneasiness amongst the younger generations. They see no future for themselves. And how do we build up an imagery that talks about changes in the production and consumption model, as you have said? How can we create those images? Like Pippa, who said that when she was a science communicator, she would only convey negative images or negative messages, like when she worked with sharks. And she had to overturn that. How do we do that? And how do we communicate alternative options to the current production and consumption model, which is at the very core of the problem? Thank you, James. Would you like to answer first?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but you're absolutely right that if you put all the emphasis on individual responsibility and individual behavior change and individual the need for individuals to take action, first of all, you're not going to get the amount of change that we need. And it is dangerous, as I think the questioner was suggesting, that it can lead to a sense of desperation and lack of hopelessness when individuals take action, but many others don't. So you quite clearly need to be communicating that there needs to be change at policy level, at national government level, at local government level, and particularly at business level, but that individuals also have a responsibility to take action. But the emphasis should clearly be in your communication that governments have to provide the framework for businesses and society and individuals to make the necessary changes. It would be wrong to suggest that it's all got to be individual action. But again, I think from a media communication point of view, it's again difficult to write stories about the need for context and government action in an interesting and an engaging way, either visually or in text. And I think that's one of the real challenges for communication via the media, is how do you present policy options and the policy context in a way that really inspires action at both societal and individual level. There are some examples, but they're not very frequent. And I think all journalists and all media have to really grapple and really have to think about that.
Jonathan, tal vez tú nos puedas hablar un poco
Hey, Jonathan, maybe you could tell
también de
us
qué esfuerzos se han
about
hecho desde
which
el
efforts
IPCC.
have been made at the IPCC Communications Office to have communication addressed to decision makers. Jonathan, are you following me? Good.
I'd agree with what James was just saying. And I mean, the IPCC isn't prescriptive in that we don't tell governments what to do, but we don't tell individual citizens what to do. But as James said, this is really the changes that are implied by climate change have to come at the government level, and obviously citizens are going to contribute to that in their own life, in their own behaviour. But one of the important things, and I've hinted this before, is that it's important that citizens, from their reading or understanding of the report, and that's where communication is important, that they put pressure on governments to make the necessary changes. Now, nobody is saying that we're going to have to stop eating food and warming or cooling our apartments or travelling to work or friends, but there are ways of doing all those things in more climate-friendly ways, and there are policy options to deal with all those things. I think this is where citizens can overcome perhaps that sense of fear or despair that comes from hearing about climate change and see a perspective for action by encouraging governments to provide an enabling framework for them and for them to live their lives and the economy to function in more sustainable and carbon-neutral ways.
Olga, tú que eres observadora de
Olga, you are
de los COP, entiendo
a
que eres
good observer you were an observer at the COP meetings. Tell us your perspective. I mean, tell us about what you see governments are doing. Well, in our research group, we have attended so far all of the climate summits. And our main criticism, our main remark with regards to what goes on in a COP is that the climate change framework convention is a convention in which the members are states. And the negotiators negotiate with the label of their country. And therefore, they will try always to reach some consensus, because decisions have to be made by consensus, and nobody knows this, but this is really difficult. So they try to reach a consensus that benefits, or at least that they do not jeopardize their country. And this is sometimes a contradiction, because we are facing a global problem. I tell my students when we are there, make a note of how many times you listen to people saying to stabilize temperature below 2 degrees, okay? And then they talk about rules, regulations, committees, commissions, records for hours and hours and hours on end. And at the end of the day, you know, what we're discussing ends up disappearing. And this is something that really concerns us, because they all miss a global vision. They have their own nation's vision. Each nation state positions itself and does whatever it can to benefit itself. But when we sum the whole thing, we see that the global vision does not solve the problem. And this is very serious. Now, the Paris Agreement is an agreement that's based on the fact that nation states develop their commitments, and they will have to say what will their mitigation commitments are. The problem is that if you make a sum of all of the mitigation commitments, the sum is not enough. The emissions we will have by 2030 distance us from the 1.5 degrees goal that we want to attain. And that's a serious problem. It's a very serious and difficult problem to solve. We're talking about striking a balance between what's individual and social, between global and local, etc. More questions, please. Hello. My name is Sofia Cabrera from Ecuador. I coordinate a scientific communication network in Ecuador. I have a question for Jonathan. Jonathan, it's very important to take into account the role played by agriculture and the responsibility of agriculturalists when it comes to controlling the effects of climate change. With the most important resource we have, which is water. In Ecuador, we had an awareness-raising strategy to work with farmers in those spaces, to be able to work with them in educational and communication proposals that allow them to develop in a better way the technical applications with regards to climate change. At the IPCC, there are some intercultural communication proposals to work with these groups, with these indigenous farmers. I mean, people, for example, who have a crucial responsibility in this process. So, do you have any intercultural communication strategy to reach these people, to actually give them some scientific communication as well? Well, Jonathan, did you hear the question?
Thank you. And firstly, I should mention that we published a report in 2019 it had a very, very long title, but basically it was about climate change and land use and degradation, desertification. But basically looking at the way that climate change affects land and agriculture, but also how changing land use contributes to climate change. And from that we saw that land can contribute to the problem of climate change. It can also be part, but not all, but be part of the solution. And you might want to look at that report for some more detail. Now, in general, the IPCC does try to engage with indigenous knowledge. It's a challenge for us because formally the way the IPCC works is it looks at published scientific literature and then assesses that to give a picture of the state of knowledge in the scientific community. So a lot of indigenous knowledge is not written down and published, so how do we access that and bring it into the IPCC process? We do have authors who come from, if you like, indigenous knowledge backgrounds, indigenous communities, and
Te escuchamos, Jonathan.
I thought I'd frozen again. And it's something that we've had expert meetings on how to improve our access to us and our interaction with those communities. And this is a continuing work in progress. We expect to see more of that as the IPCC develops. Thank you.
Gracias. Yo creo que es muy interesante justamente.
How interesting. You have really touched upon a very important point, to involve the local indigenous communities, the ones that are the furthest away from scientific communication, like rural communities, indigenous communities, and poor communities. There is another question here. Hello, good morning. My name is Luisa Martinez from the Scientific Culture Unit in Galicia. And I want to share with you some thoughts, given what my colleague Belén Matías has said about the citizens' responsibility. For example, in Galicia, we make a significant effort to reach citizens, common citizens, with regards to climate change aspects. It is true that there is a certain attitude or approach that makes them guilty or makes them feel guilty. What I miss is an empowerment of the common citizen. How do we do that empowerment? Well, through consumption. As Olga has said, the two main causes of greenhouse effect emissions is consumption and production. We are almost 8 billion people who theoretically have to eat 3 times a day. So consumption is a very powerful tool, to me the most powerful tool that we have in our hands. I'm missing on the government's and politicians' side and on everybody's side. I mean, production products and services companies should give information about the environmental cost of their products and services. And I'm referring specifically to airlines. None of them are forced to giving that information. Olga answers, I agree with all of these comments. There may be regulation mechanisms that favor the fact that companies or large multinational corporations make some decisions instead of others. Now, there are some certificates, a lot of them are voluntary. Many businesses are adhering to this type of voluntary certificates, but it is not compulsory yet, having these certificates. And we have come to a point in which it should actually be compulsory. Some of these things should be compulsory. For example, one of the things that are being discussed is a carbon tax. If the consumer has to decide between two products, when I go to the supermarket, just to give you an example, I'm amazed when I see next to local apples, apples from Chile and apples from South Africa. I mean, I'm amazed by that. And the price was very similar. So you wonder, how can it be that these products that come from South Africa, they have an incredible CO2 baggage inherent to them? If this was actually reflected in the prices, well, maybe the consumer would actually be more aware, because you end up choosing the one that looks best. So all of these regulatory mechanisms help the consumer make the right decision in order to try and reconduct the problem. And this is what we're missing. We're missing these regulation mechanisms. There is a big defense of the free market, and sometimes the free market implies a market that's not well governed, a governless mechanism, and it does not necessarily take us to the right solution. James, would you like to add anything about that?
I'm very much in favor of the question and Olga's points. Again, just seen through the prism of the media, I think it's really interesting that there's a lot of evidence that the media focused on the transport and energy sectors and their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. But the role that the agricultural sector plays in creating greenhouse gas emissions has not been given anything like the amount of attention. And that did change a bit with the IPCC report on climate change and land that Jonathan just mentioned, and a whole lot of other reports. And if you look at the survey work, many normal consumers are not aware of actually the effect that consuming meat or other aspects of your food intake can have on the climate. I think in the UK there is evidence, and that's the country I know best, that is changing, and there's much more awareness now of the link between diet and climate change and indeed health. But there's a real role, I think, for the media in highlighting that link to inform people better and to give a more informed context in which people can make decisions about what food they eat and whether they want to eat less meat or whether they want to buy local or whether they want to buy products that are more sustainably produced. But the media can play a huge role in providing that context.
Muchas gracias, James. A mí esto me genera muchas reflexiones, pero no.
Thank you. There are so excellent comments. We have 2 additional questions before we call it a session. Thank you. Hi, my name is Marcos. I am a communicator and environmental educator, and I'm a clown as well whenever I'm allowed to. It's very interesting what James said about the use of humor, the use of a sense of humor. This is the first time I hear that. I loved it. But I'm worried. I think it's very difficult to strike the right balance between to free the tensions for the message to be more palatable and to not make it serious enough. So I'd like to ask you, James, do you know of any examples that I could copy, basically? And, the rest of you, do you have any opinion, Jonathan and Olga, about the use of the sense of humor for that?
I'm really glad that you brought it up. It's not my area of research, but if you are interested, there's a new book that came out last year by a US media scholar, well known, called Max Boykoff, Boykoff, where he experimented with different types of humor, with different types of audience, in terms of trying to get more engagement from different types of audience. One of the problems for climate communication is that it tends to be people who are left-leaning or liberal, who are more concerned and more willing to take action at the personal and societal level on climate change than right-leaning or right-wing people. So this was an attempt by humor to cross the political divide and find a way of engaging audiences who wouldn't normally be interested in climate change by finding a humorous way to talk about climate change. But of course, you're absolutely right that it can be it's very difficult to get the balance right between seriousness and comedy. But I strongly suggest that you read this book, which explores those themes with concrete examples, particularly in the US, in the comedy shows, late night TV shows, Jon Stewart and others who've made some really funny programs about climate change, also sort of ridiculing some of the, not just the denialists, but some of the activists as well. And I really do think it's a very interesting area of research, and I encourage you to look at the book, Max Boykoff. I can send the organizers the link.
Tal vez lo puedes escribir también, James, en el chat de
Right. You could write it down on the chat. Well, we will actually include the book, yes. Hurrah! Well, whilst we wait for the last in-person question, I don't know whether Jonathan would like to add anything about the use of humor. Hey, Jonathan, do you have any opinions about the use of humor?
Well, I agree with what James was just saying, and I mean, it's clear, and surveys have shown that if you talk in a very formal way, using long, complex language, this might be more of an issue in English than in Spanish or French and some other languages, but it can be very distancing to an audience and put up barriers and make them. It forms a barrier to communication and makes people feel excluded or resentful about the message that is trying to be delivered. Now, humour can be a way of overcoming that. And so I think these are certainly techniques that should be and approaches that should be explored. That said, the IPCC itself probably has to stick to a very straight and direct presentation of the findings and leave these more innovative approaches to other groups.
Qué bien, gracias, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. So the last question, please. The mic is not on. Okay, could you start again? Yes, I'd like to ask you if you think that the current organizational formula used by humanity, i.e. global capitalism, so to speak, is compatible with a reasonable well-being for all of us who inhabit this planet. If the answer is no, please tell us what could science contribute, what would be the scientific contribution to change that? Well, it's not an easy question, says Olga. I am convinced that the answer is no. I'm fully convinced of that. I mean, the data are very clear. We follow a constant growth model, economic growth fueled by an energy model without which it would be impossible to keep on growing. And we're looking for this decoupling, i.e. how to keep on growing without growing our energy consumption constantly, and that's very difficult. Some countries have reached a certain level of decoupling, but worldwide, this decoupling is not yet a reality. And the background question is, and all of this economic growth, this consumption growth, does it make us happier? Does it make us live better? Does it bring us happiness? The question is not always. The answer is not always. And to me, what's hard to understand is, okay, business for business sake and growth for growth's sake. Well, that's not what it should be. The economy should be at the service of people. And we should not forget something that we have not even mentioned here, and it's the fact that in the world, in many countries have enormous developmental challenges ahead. And when a country becomes developed, as is the case of China and India recently, it is understandable that their emissions grow. You know, we could use an example. If you send a spacecraft to space, well, you need to actually use a lot of energy to get it out of Earth. Well, that's what's still pending in a large part of the world. So those of us who are part of the privileged minority, we should be well aware about our privileges, and we should be well aware that the action should be focused on our hands. And with regards to the model, of course, to me, we need a model change, thinking that we need to place people's well-being at the center, not only people in Spain or in Europe, but people all over the world. Thank you, Olga. Do we have any further comments or questions online? Right. This is a question, a very short question online. They ask us if you could write down the name of the author about, the book about humor. James, could you actually spell it for us, please? Could you spell the author's surname? It is spell it for us, please. Slowly.
That's in the chat.
Sí, es en el chat, pero parece que no.
Well, but it looks like people can't see it on the chat. Well, unfortunately, time is up. So we have no time for any further questions. This is such an interesting topic, such a hot topic, and we have had such an intense discussion that we wish we had more time. But we have a very, very strict agenda. So this is the right time to call it a session. I'd like to thank our speakers, Olga, Jonathan Lin, and James Painter. Thank you very much indeed for your brilliant presentations and answers, and I'd like to thank you all for being present here to discuss the role played by science communication for the planet's well-being. Thank you. Before leaving the room, let me give you a couple of housekeeping issues. Now we're going to have a coffee break until 11:30. Coffee is going to be served in the garden, and whilst we move to the different rooms, we have a video sent by the IPCC Secretary Abdallah Moxi, who talks about a tool that came with the IPCC report. A very interesting tool indeed. And, well, the Secretary of the IPCC has sent us this video. We thank him for that, and we want to share it with you. Once again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, James. See you soon, I hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my real pleasure to be invited to this official launch